The consent form was 11 pages long. I read all of them. Most of the volunteers the Drelathi Cognition Sciences unit had worked with before me, 2 Krethali, 1 Sulvan, a Gorathi male whose species had been studied for their exceptional psychological resilience, had signed without reading past the 3rd page. The lead researcher, Orth Vaughn, mentioned this during the intake meeting, not unkindly, more the way a person mentions something they've simply observed so many times it no longer registers as interesting. He was sitting across a narrow desk made of some pale composite material that looked like compressed fog, and he was watching me turn the pages with his 4 secondary eyes half-lidded, which I would later learn was the Drelathi equivalent of a polite, patient-waiting expression. I asked him on page 7 what exactly was meant by the phrase graduated aversion response at configurable cognitive pressure thresholds. He explained it carefully. The chamber was calibrated to produce sustained psychological stress through a combination of environmental, sensory, and neurological stimuli. Not pain, they were very precise about that. Not harm, stress. The kind of sustained, low-grade background dread that, in every species they had tested, eventually saturated the mind's regulatory capacity and produced what their science called a coherence collapse. The subject became unable to maintain baseline function. They stopped being able to eat, sleep, plan, communicate rationally. The collapse was measurable and consistent. It had a predictable onset curve for every species in their database. I asked what the average onset time was for the subjects they'd studied. He said, for the most resilient species on record, the Gorathi male I'd mentioned, who had something of a legend in the Institute's files, it had been 61 hours. I told him that seemed like a long time to be stressed out. He looked at me for a moment with all 6 eyes at once, which I would later learn was the Drelathi equivalent of a very controlled, professionally contained surprise. Then he handed me the pen, and I signed the form on page 11, and I noted my weight and height and general health status in the boxes provided, and I asked if they had coffee in the pre-intake suite, and he said they could source something functionally analogous, and I said that would be fine. The study was voluntary. The Institute had put out a call across the diplomatic exchange network for human civilian research participants. They wanted baseline data on human psychological stress responses, which they didn't have, because humans were new enough to the wider community that almost no one had bothered to study us in a controlled setting. The call had gone out through the liaison office in the Terran quarter of Kael'das Station, and it had come to me because I had the right combination of credentials. I was a behavioral scientist by training. I had no immediate family dependencies during the study window, and I had volunteered for sensory isolation research back on Earth 3 times without incident, which was noted in my professional record. What the intake form did not say, and what Orth Vaughn did not say during the briefing, and what I did not learn until day 9 of the study, was that every member of the research team had a private consensus before the trial began. They were not cruel about it. They were not dismissive of humans. They were, in fact, quite interested in us, which was the whole point of the study. But they had the data. They had 61 hours as the outer bound of coherence maintenance. They had stress response curves for 7 species across 24 trials. They had a calibrated chamber that had never, in its operational history, failed to produce a collapse within its designed window. They had given me a window of 90 hours as the study duration, with the understanding that collapse would almost certainly arrive well before that. They had a pool going among the 4 of them. Orth Vaughn had bet on 42 hours. His junior researcher, a young female named Tessavith Orr, had bet on 31, which the team considered optimistic in the wrong direction, meaning she expected an early break, not a late one. The 2 instrument technicians, they were not technically researchers, but they were present in the monitoring suite around the clock, and they had seen enough trials to have opinions, had bet on 50 and 58, respectively. No one had bet on 90. I did not know any of this going in. What I knew walking into Chamber 12 on the morning of the first day, was that it was a rectangular room approximately 4 meters by 6, with a sleeping platform along one wall, a small sanitation alcove behind a partition, a food dispensary panel set into the wall above a narrow counter, and a ventilation grid in the ceiling that also, I suspected, housed most of the sensory apparatus. The walls were a neutral gray-white. The lighting was even and steady, the kind of diffuse overhead light you find in laboratories and administrative offices everywhere in the known galaxy. It turned out, regardless of species, something about that particular luminance spectrum and diffusion pattern that most biological visual systems found inoffensive. There was a small table, there was a chair. There was a shelf above the sleeping platform with 3 items I had been allowed to bring: a physical notebook, a pen, and a photograph. I'd brought a picture of the view from my apartment window back on Earth, looking south over a river at morning. Nothing dramatic, just water and light and the edge of a bridge. Something familiar to look at if I needed one. They did not restrict me from having it. The protocol, as Orth Vaughn explained, was that environmental stimuli would be introduced gradually and progressively, and my responses would be monitored in real time through the sensor array, and the trial would be terminated if my physical health entered a critical threshold. Otherwise, the room would do what it was designed to do, and I would respond how I responded, and they would record it. He asked at the threshold of the door whether I had any final questions. I asked whether the food dispensary did anything hot. He said it could produce heated items, yes. I said good, and I went inside, and the door sealed behind me. I spent the first day mostly reading the notebook I'd brought, which was already half filled with notes from a paper I'd been working on about cognitive adaptation in novel environments. I ate twice from the dispensary, something that tasted roughly like lentil soup, which was better than I'd expected. And I did 40 minutes of floor exercises in the afternoon because there was nothing else active to do, and I went asleep at what I estimated was a reasonable hour, using the light cycle to gauge it since there was no clock, and I slept for what felt like 7 hours, which was about what I normally managed. I had expected, going in, that the absence of stimulation would be the hard part. I had done sensory isolation work before, back on Earth. I knew what the inside of a quiet room felt like after a long while, knew the way the mind started generating its own noise when the external world stopped providing it. I had prepared myself for boredom more than anything else. What I had not anticipated was how quickly I would find the room habitable, not comfortable, exactly, but workable. There was enough in my own head to occupy the time. There had always been enough in my own head to occupy the time. I had never fully understood, until I was inside a room specifically engineered to produce distress and found myself mostly fine, that this was not a universal condition. On the second day, the first stimuli arrived. I noticed the subsonic frequency before I could identify it. It was below hearing threshold, which meant I couldn't process it as a sound. It arrived instead as a generalized sense of unease, the kind of low background wrongness that usually in nature means something large is moving nearby. My hindbrain registered it before my forebrain could catch up, and for about 40 minutes on day 2, I found myself alert and slightly tense without being able to explain why, the way you feel in a room where you can't find the source of a gas smell. I wrote about it in my notebook. I described the onset, the quality of the sensation, the way it seemed to inhabit the lower back and the base of the skull simultaneously. It was, from a professional standpoint, interesting. I had read about subsonic stress induction as a research method, but had never been the subject of a controlled application before. I noted my heart rate by feel, elevated, maybe 10 beats above resting, and made an estimate of the amplitude based on the physical response. And then I made the lentil soup thing for lunch and sat down and ate it while the wrongness hummed along underneath everything, like a second floor in the room. By the afternoon of day 2, I had mostly habituated to it. I understood later, From Orth Vaughn's notes in the trial record, that habituation to the subsonic component at that level had never been observed before. In every prior trial subject, the subsonic frequency alone at the day 2 amplitude had been sufficient to sustain continuous low-grade stress response throughout the remaining protocol window, preventing sleep consolidation and beginning the coherence degradation process. It was, in their model, the foundation layer. Everything else was built on top of it. If the foundation held the subject in a state of unresolvable low-level alarm, then each subsequent layer would arrive into a system that was already compromised, already spending resources on the unresolvable alarm, and therefore less able to absorb the next insult. The foundation was not producing that response in me by the end of day 2. They increased the amplitude overnight. I noticed the change the morning of day 3. It was more insistent, more physical, the kind of sensation you feel in your back teeth and the cartilage of your ears. I sat with it for a few minutes after waking, taking stock. Then I did my exercises, ate breakfast, and spent the morning writing out the section of my paper I'd been stuck on, because the slightly elevated arousal state turned out to be mildly useful for concentration. Something about the background pressure sharpened attention, the way a moderate amount of caffeine does, or the way a cool room does. The body is slightly more on than it would otherwise be, and that activation spreads to whatever you're working on. I wrote for 3 hours. It was a good morning. In the monitoring suite, according to the record, Orth Vaughn reviewed the overnight biosensor data and then sat quietly for approximately 7 minutes before saying anything to the team. Tessavith Orr's notes from that session record that he said, "Recalibrate the baseline model. We may need to revise the onset assumptions." It was, apparently, the most uncertain thing he had said in 12 years of running the protocol. The team recalibrated. The revised model still predicted a collapse window beginning no later than 70 hours. This was generous. It assumed human resilience significantly exceeded the Gorathi record. It was, as events would show, still not generous enough. On day 3, they added the light. It was not bright or painful. The protocol was careful about that. No physical harm was the line they did not cross, and they were rigorous scientists who meant it. What the light did was shift in ways that disrupted the brain's time sense. It cycled in a pattern that was close to biological day-night cadences, but not quite, slightly too fast in one phase and too slow in another, enough to introduce a chronic low-level uncertainty about where in the day you were, which in turn placed a steady metabolic tax on the internal clock mechanisms. Duration perception distorted. Time felt longer than it was. The gaps between meals felt elastic. Sleep became harder to time correctly. I noticed this too, and I wrote about it, and I found a partial countermeasure within about 6 hours, which was to anchor my time sense not to light but to hunger. The body knows when it last ate. It knows roughly how long sleep takes to feel complete. If you stop using the light as a clock and start using your own physiology as the reference point, the disruption loses most of its leverage. It's not perfect, you're working with cruder instruments, but it's functional. I also started doing a specific set of mental exercises I'd learned years ago during a period when I'd been having trouble sleeping. Anchoring attention to the present moment in a deliberate, methodical way, cataloging what was physically happening in the body and the room without evaluating it, just noting it. Researchers call it various things in various fields. I thought of it simply as paying attention on purpose. It made the distorted time feel less threatening because I stopped needing to know where in time I was. I was here. That was enough. I slept on day 3 for what felt like 8 hours. The biosensor data from that night, as later reviewed, showed a sleep architecture that was within normal human parameters, with one brief arousal episode in what would have been the middle of the night, lasting approximately 4 minutes, during which I appeared to lie still, breathe evenly, and then return to sleep. No distress. No elevated cortisol. No elevated heart rate. Tessivith Orr's notes record that she ran the sensor calibration twice the following morning because she thought the readings were malfunctioning. Day 4. They introduced the predator cues. This one was not subtle and was not meant to be. The Drelathi had compiled, over decades of xenobiological research, a library of environmental signatures associated with apex predator presence across dozens of species' native biomes. The chemical markers, the acoustic patterns, the subtle electromagnetic fluctuations that living things had evolved over millions of years to register as danger of the most immediate kind. They had analogized these signatures against human evolutionary biology and identified the ones most likely to activate the human threat detection system at a deep, instinctive level. Things that smelled faintly of large carnivores, in frequencies below conscious identification. Sounds at the edge of what the human ear could distinguish that pattern matched against old biological warnings. Micro-vibrations in the floor that mimicked the movement of something large moving nearby, just at the threshold of perception. They had done this for the Gorathi male, who had exhibited strong initial responses to the predator cue layer. His stress curve had spiked sharply on day 4, the last complete day before his coherence collapse. The spike had been, in their records, one of the steepest they had ever recorded. They attributed a significant portion of his ultimate collapse to the interaction between the predator cue layer and the pre-established foundation damage from the prior 3 days. The cumulative load by day 4 had been too great. They introduced these stimuli gradually over day 4, layered over the subsonic and the light. I noticed them immediately. What I felt for the first hour or so was a very clear, very old animal alertness. Every hair on my forearms was up. My attention narrowed. My hearing sharpened. My body had decided at a level well below rational processing that something was close and that it might be a threat and that I should be ready. I sat with that for a while. I have had this feeling before, not in a laboratory, but in the ordinary course of human life. Late at night alone in a place that felt wrong. The edge of a trail in a forest where something shifted in the undergrowth. The interval between hearing a sound you couldn't identify and your brain generating an explanation for it. A particular quality of shadow in a room at 3 in the morning that the rational mind dismisses and the animal mind does not. This was not a new feeling. This was, if anything, a feeling most humans spend their whole lives brushing up against on a regular basis and learning, over and over, to move through. We are not a species that has the luxury of a clean break between civilization and predation. We carry the older world inside us always. The hair on our forearms remembers. I went to the shelf and looked at the photograph of the river for a while. I made something from the dispensary. I sat down and ate it. After about 2 hours, the alertness settled into a low background state, still present, still active, still tracking every microsound in the room with a small, constant portion of my attention, but no longer dominant. It receded to the position that fear usually occupies in daily human life, which is somewhere between background music and weather, always potentially relevant, never consuming, most of the time just a condition of the air. I went back to my notebook. I wrote for the rest of the afternoon. In the monitoring suite, there was a discussion. The record does not capture all of it, but Tessivith Orr's log notes that Orith Vaughn asked each team member to review the stress response curves independently and report their findings. And when they compared notes, all 4 of them had arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the curves were behaving in a way their models did not predict. The subsonic habituation was reproducible across 3 days of measurement. The time disruption countermeasure the subject had developed spontaneously was not a known adaptive strategy in their literature. And the predator cue response, which in every other subject had produced a sustained, escalating anxiety curve beginning within the first 4 hours of introduction, was showing something that looked less like escalation and more like. And here, Orith Vaughan apparently used a phrase that Tessavith Orr noted phonetically, because she had not heard it before, a settling effect. The Gorathi male, their most resilient prior subject, had held his coherence for 61 hours after full protocol activation. His stress curves had shown a classic sustained elevation pattern, high but stable, until the point where stability had become impossible to maintain, and the collapse had arrived quickly, as collapses do. My stress curves were doing something that did not look like sustained elevation. They looked like adaptation. On day 5, they added the social isolation layer. This was the component that, in their experience, most reliably accelerated the final progression to collapse. The prior components, subsonic, light disruption, predator cues, were what they called the load-bearing layers. They saturated the nervous system's regulatory capacity. The isolation layer was what they called the precipitant. The removal of social contact, the elimination of any external validation signal, the reduction of the self to a single point without reference or witness. This was, in virtually every social species they had studied, the thing that finally broke the load-bearing structure. The Krethali had collapsed within 6 hours of full isolation activation, the Sulvan within 4. Even the Gorathi male, who had held longer than anyone else, had deteriorated visibly within 12 hours of the isolation layer's full engagement. There was something about being truly, structurally alone that found the crack in every mind they had ever tested. The chamber had always been quiet, but on day 5 something changed in the quality of the quiet. I noticed it within an hour. It was not a new sound and it was not a new stimulus. It was more like a shift in the weight of things, the way a room feels different when you've been in it alone for too long and the aloneness starts to have a texture. The silence became slightly more total. The walls felt closer without actually being closer. The space between me and everything outside the door became something I could almost measure. I thought about my sister. I had been composing a letter to her in my head since around day 2. Not anxiously, just the way you compose things when you have time and quiet and not much else to do. She was 3 years younger than me and lived in a coastal city and had 2 children and a husband who worked in marine engineering. And she called me every Sunday at roughly the same time each week, and the calls were always about the same things: her work, her children, a book she'd been reading, a trip they were planning, ordinary life in fine-grained detail. I had not seen her in 8 months. I thought about the way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which I had always found deeply annoying and which I had found, since the distance between us had grown, oddly charming. A small specific thing that I had not appreciated properly when I was close enough to be annoyed by it. I thought about other people, too. A colleague at the research station who made the best terrible coffee I had ever tasted, strong and somehow simultaneously watery, achieved through a technique no one had ever been able to reverse engineer. An old professor whose advice I had not followed and who had been right, and who had never said "I told you so," which I had come to think was probably the more significant thing. A man I had known for a short time years ago, who had not become anything more than he was but who had mattered, the way some people matter, without context or explanation. I thought about Earth. I thought about the river in the photograph. I knew its name and I knew its history, and I knew the specific time of year the light hit the water in exactly that way, late October, about an hour after sunrise, when the air was cold enough that there was often a faint mist at the surface, and the light came in low and oblique, and turned everything gold and silver at once. I had stood at that window on that kind of morning more times than I had counted, and I had not thought to count, because it had not occurred to me that there would be a day when the counting would feel relevant. Things you take for granted are always the things you did not think to memorize while you had them. I thought about these things the way you think about them when you're far from home, clearly, without particular pain. They were real, they were mine, they would still be there. I wrote the letter to my sister in my notebook. not with any urgency, just because I had the time, and because writing things down made them feel more present, and because she was worth the time. I wrote about the chamber and what it was like and the odd quality of the air and the photograph of the river that was sitting on the shelf. I wrote about the paper I'd been working on and how the isolation had actually helped it. You could think more cleanly without the constant small interruptions of ordinary social life, the messages and the logistics and the ambient background noise of other people's presence. I wrote about the research team, who I had only met briefly but who seemed serious and careful and good at their work. I wrote about missing Sunday calls. Then I did my evening exercises and went to sleep. The record from day 5 shows a biosensor profile that is, as Orth Vaughan would later describe in the published study, anomalous across every measured parameter. Heart rate nominal, cortisol within normal human resting parameters, sleep architecture intact, neural activity consistent with what would later be characterized, on consultation with a human neuroscientist at the Taryn Institute, as a resting state with episodic directed autobiographical recall. Essentially, a mind that was comfortable in its solitude, moving calmly through its own interior, making no emergency of the silence. The monitoring team had been watching the isolation layer's activation in real time. They had expected to see the characteristic stress curve inflection within 2 to 4 hours. The inflection was the signature of the precipitant engaging, the point where the load-bearing damage met the isolation accelerant, and the system began its final descent. Every subject they had ever tested had produced this inflection. It was as reliable, in Orth Vaughan's experience, as any measurement in his field. My curve did not inflect. It showed the usual slight elevation at isolation layer onset, the recognition event, the same initial registration they had seen with every other stimulus, and then it settled, the way everything else had settled, into the background pattern. The Drelathi equivalent of a shrug, one of the technicians would later say, though he said it quietly, mostly to himself, watching the readout in the small hours of the station's night cycle. On day 6, they ran a full diagnostic of the chamber's sensor array. They had not done this mid-trial before. It was not a standard protocol step. But the data was so far outside their expected parameters that Orth Vaughan had to account for the possibility that the equipment was malfunctioning. He ran the diagnostic at 3 in the morning of day 6 while I was asleep. Every sensor came back within calibration tolerance. The stimulus generators were operating at design parameters. The biosensors were reading accurately. The equipment was fine. Orth Vaughan's personal log from that night contains a single line: "The equipment is not the problem." He filed the diagnostic results with the study record and went to his quarters, and according to his own account in the published study's methodology notes, did not sleep particularly well. On day 7, they increased the predator Q intensity to a level they had not previously used in a trial, which was above the standard protocol ceiling. They had a safety review before doing it, the 3-member review for protocol deviations, which took them about 40 minutes, and they cleared the deviation on the basis that it was still within physical safety parameters, and the scientific interest justified the push. I noticed the increase within about 20 minutes. It was stronger than anything before, a very present, very physical sense of wrongness, the kind that pulls your attention like a magnet and keeps pulling, the kind that is very difficult to reason with because it is not arriving through the reasoning channels. It was sitting in the base of my skull and the pit of my stomach simultaneously, and it was not quiet. It was the most intense, sustained version of the old animal fear I had felt since the trial began. I sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and breathed. I have had worse. Not dramatically worse. I am not, by any accounting, a person with an unusual history or a remarkable tolerance for suffering. I have had ordinary human experiences of fear and grief and physical pain, and the specific long-term grinding anxiety of extended hard circumstances. I have had periods of my life that were frightening. I have been in situations where the fear was rational, and the right response was to feel it fully and keep moving. I have lost people I did not expect to lose. I have been ill in a way that took a long time to recover from, and that changed some things permanently. I have made large mistakes and lived inside the consequences for sustained periods, the kind of mistakes that don't resolve cleanly, but instead leave a residue that you carry forward and eventually learn to carry lightly, the way you learn to carry most things. None of this is exceptional. Every human I know has their version of it. What it means, cumulatively, is that fear has been a frequent enough visitor that I know its patterns. I know it arrives with urgency, as if it were the most important thing in the room, and that this urgency is the thing that makes it difficult, not the content of it, but the certainty it carries that it must be attended to immediately and completely. I know that the urgency does not always correspond to actual danger. I know that breathing helps, not because it solves anything, but because it moves you from the stimulus into the response, and in that gap the stimulus loses a little of its absolute authority. I know that the thing that feels unbearable usually isn't, and that the difference between enduring something and being destroyed by it is often just the question of whether you can stay present through the discomfort, without deciding that the discomfort is the end of you. Humans learn this young mostly, not from anyone teaching it, just from the ordinary attrition of life. The intensity on day 7 was high. I sat with it for about 25 minutes, breathing, doing the attention anchoring exercises. The 25 minutes felt longer than 25 minutes. The time distortion was still operating, and combined with the heightened alertness, it stretched time significantly. But I knew it was stretching, and I knew why, and knowing those things helped, not because knowing diffuses the fear, but because it tells you the fear has a shape and a mechanism, and is therefore not infinite. Then it reached the level it always reached, that steady background position, loud but not consuming, and I stood up, washed my face at the sanitation alcove, made something from the dispensary, and sat down to read back through the letter I'd been writing to my sister, revising a few passages where I'd been less precise than I wanted to be. In the monitoring suite, the team had been watching my biosensor readout in real time during the 25 minutes. The record captures what Orth Vaughn said, at the moment when the stress curve broke from its rising trajectory and began the characteristic settling shape that by now they had come to recognize as my response to a new stimulus. It is adapting again. Tessavith Orr's notes from day 7 include a line that is recorded without further context. I don't understand what we are looking at. The second technician, whose duty log is somewhat less formal in its notation style, recorded the following at 17 minutes into the above-ceiling stimulus event. Subject eating, not looking at walls, writing something. Day 8 passed quietly. I had reached a kind of equilibrium with the chamber that I would have had difficulty articulating at the time, but which I would later describe, in my own post-trial report, as a working relationship with the conditions. The subsonic was there, and I had largely stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing traffic noise after a week in a new apartment, not because it is absent, but because it has been filed correctly in the part of the mind that handles background conditions rather than foreground emergencies. The light disruption was there, and I had found my own timekeeping. The predator cues were there, and they were like a standing watch in the back of my awareness, present, employed, not wasting energy on alarm. The isolation was there, and I had populated it with the things I carried inside me, which turned out to be enough. I spent most of day 8 working on the paper. I was in a good stretch of it, the kind where the ideas were coming in their proper order and the language was cooperating, the kind of intellectual stretch that you can only get inside genuine sustained quiet. I wrote about 4,000 words in my notebook across the day. I ate 3 times. I did exercises in the morning and the evening. I slept well. I also spent some time, in the evening of day 8, thinking about why the chamber was not breaking me in the way it had broken the others, and whether there was something specific I was doing or whether it was simply what I was. I came to no definitive conclusion. But I thought about the history of the places humans had lived. The cold places, the dry places, the places where the food was never quite reliable and the water was sometimes absent and the winters were long and the summers were brief and the work was continuous and the grief was ordinary and the danger was ambient and never quite resolved. The places where people had lived for generation after generation, not because the conditions were good, but because leaving was harder, or because the land was theirs, or because they had run out of somewhere else to go. I thought about the things humans had built in those places, and the things humans had written, and the things humans had sung, because even in the worst of it the singing had continued, which was something I had always found remarkable and now found, inside a room engineered to produce despair, slightly clarifying. I thought about the particular kind of knowledge you acquire from sustained hard circumstances, not the knowledge you acquire by studying something, but the knowledge you acquire by living inside it long enough that it stops being a crisis and becomes a condition. There is a shift that happens at some point in a difficult stretch, where the difficulty stops being the emergency and starts being the weather, where you stop asking when it will end and start asking what you are going to do today inside it. That shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is more like discovering that you have been walking for a long time and you are still walking, and your legs are still working and the ground is still under them, and that this fact, simple, physical, unglamorous, is actually the whole of what you need to know. We are not a species that emerged from an easy world. We are a species that emerged from a world that was trying to kill us in a wide variety of ways simultaneously, and we had a long time to get used to it. The fear is in us, the old animal fear, the subsonic dread, the predator cue response, the grief of isolation. All of it is in us. We did not evolve past it. We evolved alongside it. We learned over a very long time to be functional inside it, to keep building, keep writing, keep singing, keep getting up in the morning and doing the next necessary thing, not because we had conquered the fear, but because we had learned, through long practice, that the fear and the living were not mutually exclusive. That is not a virtue exactly. It is a fact about us, a fact the chamber was, apparently, in the process of confirming. On day 9, Orth Vaughn entered the chamber. This was not in the protocol. The protocol provided for no contact between research team and subject during the trial window. It was a foundational requirement of the isolation layer. Any contact would contaminate the data, provide exactly the social reference point the isolation was designed to remove. Orth Vaughn had designed this protocol. He knew the requirement. He had, in 12 years, never violated it. He entered anyway. I looked up from the notebook when the door opened. He stepped in and stood in the doorway for a moment, all 6 eyes on me, and I could see in the set of his brow fringe. I had learned to read Drelathi expression somewhat over the prior week of intake and preparation, something I did not at first have a word for. Later I would think of it as the look of a scientist who has been confronted with a result that is real and has had to revise, not just the model, but the assumptions underneath the model. He said, "How are you?" I said, "Good, I've been working on a paper. Is the trial over?" He said, "No." There was a pause. I said, "Do you want to sit down?" He came in and sat in the chair. I was sitting on the sleeping platform. We were in a room that smelled faintly of synthetic lentils and floor exercises, and the particular quality of recycled air that deep station facilities have, and the subsonic was humming along underneath everything, and the light was in one of its slower phases, and we looked at each other. He said, "You are aware that this facility has a response history. 61 hours is the longest coherence window we have recorded." I said, "You mentioned that in intake." He said, "You are in day 9. I said, "I know." He looked at me for a long time. I waited. He said, "Do you find the conditions difficult?" I thought about this carefully because it deserved a careful answer. I said, "Yes. The predator Q layer is difficult. It's demanding. The isolation is it has weight. Yes, I notice it." He said, "And yet." And yet, I thought about how to say it without making it sound like boasting, because it wasn't boasting. It was just a fact about living in a body that had been shaped by a particular kind of history. I said, "I've had worse stretches. Not this concentrated maybe, but longer." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean that most humans go through periods of their lives that are frightening and unrelenting and that feel while you're in them like they might not end. Jobs that are grinding and isolating. Relationships that break in slow motion over years. Illnesses, loss, long grief. Things that don't collapse you because collapsing you would still leave you collapsed, and life continues regardless and you have to be functional inside it. So you learn." I paused. "You learn that fear is something you can be in without it consuming you. You learn that the thing making it worse is usually the decision that it's unbearable, not the thing itself." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're describing a learned tolerance." I said, "I'm describing being a person." He sat with that for a while. He asked a few more questions, careful ones. The questions of a researcher taking data in an unplanned session and knowing it, trying to be precise despite the circumstances. He asked whether the time distortion had been continuously present or intermittent. He asked whether I had experienced any intrusive ideation. The specific term he used was drelathy, which his translator rendered as involuntary recursive fear cycling, which I understood as the phenomenon where a frightened mind loops back to the thing that frightens it and cannot find the exit. I told him I had not experienced that, or at least not in any sustained way. I said that when my mind moved toward the difficult things, I let it look at them and then moved on, and that I had found the moving on was mostly available if you didn't fight the looking. He wrote this down in a small recording device he had brought. He left about 20 minutes later without further protocol commentary, and the door sealed again. I went back to the notebook. I wrote for another 2 hours. I went asleep. The record from day 9 is the most extensively annotated in the trial file. Orith Vaughan's personal research notes, which would later be included in the published study as Appendix C, contain a passage of approximately 800 words in which he attempts to characterize what he had seen in Chamber 12. Not the data, but the quality of it, the thing that the biosensors could measure and the behavioral logs could log, but that neither of them quite captured. He used several drelathy terms that do not translate cleanly into standard, but the passage that was eventually rendered in translation, and which became the most cited section of the study in the xenopsychology literature, reads approximately as follows. The subject does not appear to experience sustained aversion stimuli the way any previously studied cognate does. This is not because the stimuli fail to register. The biosensor data confirms registration and appropriate initial response. It is because, subsequent to registration, the subject's nervous system initiates a process that does not appear in our models. It is not suppression. Suppression shows in the chemistry, as avoidance, as the cost of holding something down. It is not desensitization in the classical sense. The response does not simply fade. It is more closely analogous to what we observe in organisms that have evolved in genuinely hostile environments over very long periods, a reclassification of the threatening signal from acute emergency to chronic condition, and a corresponding reallocation of cognitive resources away from the emergency response and back toward ordinary function. The system adapts, not just physiologically, cognitively, behaviorally. The subject continues to work, rest, eat, maintain social and emotional connections through memory and reflection, and pursue intellectual goals inside an environment that, by every metric we have, should be preventing all of those things. He ended the section with a sentence that his junior researcher later told me she had found in his notes already when she was compiling the appendix, written apparently not for the paper but as a private notation. I wonder if they know what they are. On day 10, I organized my notes. I had accumulated, over 9.5 days, approximately 62 pages of handwritten content across the paper I'd been working on and the letter to my sister, and a set of observations about the chamber that I was increasingly thinking might form the basis of a separate paper, focused on human adaptive response to calibrated stress environments from the perspective of the subject rather than the observer. It was a perspective that, as far as I could tell from my professional reading, was not well represented in the xenopsychological literature, probably because most subjects either had not been in a position to maintain detailed records or had not known to. I had the unusual advantage of being both a subject and a researcher, and of having arrived with a notebook and a professional habit of observation. The data I was sitting on was not biosensor data. It was phenomenological, first person, the kind of data that is hard to gather and harder to interpret, and that, when gathered carefully, is not replicated by any instrument. I organized the notes into 3 sections, refining the paper's argument in the morning and working on the second essay's structure in the afternoon. In the evening, I read back through the letter to my sister, added a few final paragraphs, and folded it carefully into the back of the notebook. I thought that evening about what Orth Vaughn had asked me on day 9, about what it felt like. I tried to be honest with myself about the answer, because I am a researcher and honesty about your data is the whole point. The conditions in Chamber 12 were not comfortable. They were not nothing. The predator Q layer was exhausting in a specific way, not destabilizing, but like carrying a constant moderate weight, the way sustained alertness always is, the way any chronic condition taxes you over time even when you have learned to function inside it. The isolation had its own character, its own low persistent ache, the feeling of being at a distance from the people who made up the context of your life. I did not enjoy being alone for this long. I did not enjoy the subsonic. I did not enjoy the light disruption or the elastic time or the way the walls had, by day 10, begun to feel very slightly smaller than they were, the way confined spaces always do when you have spent long enough inside them. But the question I had been turning over since day 9 was not whether I found the conditions difficult. The question was what difficult meant. Whether difficult meant unendurable or whether difficult just meant difficult, a category of experience that humans appeared to have sorted, through long practice and no particular choice in the matter, into the folder labeled ordinary life. I had been thinking about the families I had read about in historical records, in oral histories, in the accounts people sometimes gave when someone thought to ask them, who had stayed in hard places for years at a time, who had lived through winters of real scarcity and losses of real consequence and isolations of real duration, not 90-hour protocol windows but seasons and years, and who had remained functional, had maintained their relationships and their humor and their intellectual lives and their love for the people around them, because the alternative was a kind of surrender that the circumstances of their lives had not made available to them, not because they were exceptional, not because they had been trained, but because they were people, and people, when the conditions require it, mostly continue. I thought about this, and I looked at the photograph of the river, and I thought, we come from a long line of people who stayed. On day 11, at 9:17 in the morning by the internal research log, Orth Vaughn called the team together in the monitoring suite and formally recommended terminating the trial. Not because the subject had reached collapse. The formal termination recommendation, filed with the Institute's Ethics and Protocol Review Board, cited 3 grounds. First, the scientific objectives of the trial had been substantially achieved. Sufficient data had been collected to characterize the human stress response profile across all primary protocol components, and additional data collection was unlikely to yield proportionally new findings. The curves had stabilized into patterns that were, at this point, predictive. More time would produce more data of the same kind, not different data. Second, the physical and psychological health of the research subject remained within normal parameters by all measures, and the study was at a natural empirical plateau. The 90-hour window had been exceeded by more than a factor of 2 without any approach toward collapse. Third, and this was the unusual ground, the one that the ethics board would later discuss at length in their review of the study, and that would be cited in subsequent revisions to the Institute's protocol guidelines. Sustained observation of a non-collapsing subject had begun to produce measurable stress response elevations in the monitoring team itself. The ethics board review documented this carefully and with some evident discomfort. The technician who had bet on 58 hours had, by day 10, stopped sleeping a full night in the duty quarters. He had begun, according to his own wellness log, which the Institute required all staff to maintain during active trials, to experience difficulty with the transition periods between duty shifts, a hypervigilance at handoffs that he described as a feeling of not being able to fully trust that nothing had changed while he was away. Tessavith Orr had begun, according to her own log entries, to second-guess the equipment despite 3 clean diagnostic runs. She reported checking the calibration records more frequently than was operationally necessary, and then checking them again. She reported a recurring uncertainty that she had described as, "The absence of the expected response is itself beginning to feel like a threat." Orth Vaughn himself, in his private notes from day 10, had written that watching the biosensor feeds had become difficult to do for extended periods, not because of anything in the data, but because of what was not in the data, the absence where the collapse curve should have been, the steady onward ordinary life of a person in an environment that was designed to prevent exactly that. He wrote, "I believe I have begun to find the subject's equanimity distressing. This is not a rational response. I am aware that it is not rational. I am also aware that I cannot fully correct for it, which is a new experience for me in 12 years of this work." He recommended termination. The board approved. I was told about the termination through the intercom. The door opened at 10 in the morning of day 11, and I walked out with my notebook and my photograph and the pen, and I walked into the intake room that I had first seen 11 days ago, and Orth Vaughn and Tessavith Orr were both there, and the 2 instrument technicians were visible through the glass panel of the monitoring suite, and they all looked at me, and I looked back at them, and there was a pause. I said, "Is the debriefing going to be long? I'd like to send a message to my sister." Orth Vaughn said, "We can make that available immediately if you'd like." I said, "After is fine, it's not urgent, she'll be home Sunday." The debrief took approximately 4 hours. I answered every question they asked, as precisely as I could, and I tried to be useful. The data they had was the data. There was no narrative I could give them that would clarify or complicate the biosensor record, but I could tell them what it had been like from the inside, what I had noticed, and when, what the adaptive strategies had been and where I had learned them, which was mostly nowhere in particular, just from being alive for the time I had been alive. I described the hunger-based timekeeping, which Orth Vaughn took extensive notes on. I described the attention-anchoring exercises, and he asked a number of questions about their origin and structure that took up most of the second hour. I described the way the predator cues had settled, and the way the isolation had settled, and the way every successive stimulus had gone through the same sequence: registration, intensity, and then the movement toward background, and I tried to explain what that movement felt like from the inside, though I found this difficult because from the inside it did not feel like a technique. It felt like being a person. At the end, Orth Vaughn asked whether I would be willing to participate in a follow-up study. He said they were designing an extended protocol based on the data from this trial, and they would like a human subject who had already completed the baseline. He said the follow-up would be longer. I asked how much longer. He said they were considering 30 days. I said I'd need to check my schedule, but it was probably fine. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Are you not afraid?" I thought about this. I thought about the river in the photograph, which was now sitting on the intake room table between us. I thought about my sister calling on Sundays. I thought about the 62 pages of notes and the paper that was now substantially finished, and the letter I had written with care over 9 days of silence. I thought about Orth Vaughn's question from day 9, and the answer I had given, and whether 30 days in a room was something that should frighten me more than 11 days had. I said of 30 days in a room, not really. I said I've had longer. He did not respond immediately. He wrote something in the session record. He did not show me what it was. The study was published 14 months later in the Journal of Comparative Xenopsychology, under Orth Vaughn's name with 4 co-authors including Tessavith Orr. The title of the paper was a careful piece of scientific language that meant, in plain terms, human beings process sustained aversion stimuli through an adaptive mechanism that does not appear in the current cognition literature for any other studied species. The abstract's final sentence noted that the mechanism appeared to be generalized rather than trained. That is, it was not the product of the subject's professional background or any specific preparation, but was consistent with behavioral patterns observed in human historical and cultural records across a wide range of non-research contexts. It was, to use the paper's precise wording, characteristic of the species, not of the individual. Which was another way of saying what I had said to Orth Vaughn in Chamber 12 on day 9, which was that we come by it honestly. The paper generated considerable discussion in the field. Several response articles appeared over the following year, most of them focused on methodology. There were legitimate questions about sample size, about the generalizability of a single subject trial, about the degree to which my research background might have constituted a form of preparation, even if it was not the kind they had been accounting for. These were fair questions. Science is the right place to ask them. Orth Vaughn addressed them carefully in a follow-up correspondence, and noted that the Institute was already recruiting for a multi-subject replication study. One response article, authored by a Sullivan xenopsychologist at a research station I had not heard of before, made the argument that the results were less surprising than they appeared, that the human evolutionary record, if examined carefully, contained ample evidence of exactly this kind of sustained dread habituation, and that the more interesting scientific question was not whether humans could adapt to chronic fear, but what the upper limit of that adaptation was, and whether it had one. The article suggested that the Institute's existing protocol might be insufficient to find the limit, and proposed a substantially more intensive research paradigm. Orth Vaughn published a short reply noting that the Institute would take the suggestion under consideration. He did not mention the monitoring team's wellness logs. He did not mention the termination grounds. The reply was very careful and very measured and very professional, and I read it twice, and I thought it was probably the most diplomatically understated thing I had ever encountered in an academic exchange. The Institute invited me back for the follow-up study 8 months after the paper was published. By that point, the study had circulated widely enough in the xenopsychological community that there were 3 other research groups requesting access to human subjects, and the liaison office in the Tarrant Quarter had begun developing a formal research participant program with a waiting list. I went back. I did the 30 days. I finished the second paper while I was inside and began outlining a third. The post-trial comment I left on the official record in the comment field of the exit form was 3 sentences long. It is the section of the follow-up study that gets cited most often in review articles about human adaptive resilience, in introductory chapters of xenopsychology textbooks, and once, in a graduate seminar I attended 2 years later as a visiting lecturer, as the thing a student read aloud to open the first session of the course. It said the conditions were difficult. I would not describe them as unusual. I have lived through worse, and so has almost everyone I know. That was all. Orith Vaughn, I was told, read the comment twice, set the form down, and did not say anything for a while. I think he was beginning to understand something. I am not sure even now that he found it comforting.